Sarah. Hi, everybody. I'm Cullen. I'm the pastor here, and we are all out having fun, making a difference, and discovering faith together here at Northern Light Church. You are the proud, the few who are not out of town this weekend. So thank you so much for being here and filling this place with your joy and your spirit, even if we aren't filled with large numbers of people. That's okay. God is still present. It only takes 2 or 3, right? So we got that covered and then some. Looking forward to all the great things that we're celebrating together today and this week. We've got the Kyle family coming next week to share in music. Joni made a great point about how, if you invite friends to church next week, you're not inviting them to church. You're inviting them to a free concert at your church. So that's a great way to get someone's foot in the door who might have been thinking about it but hesitant. And also, today I'm going to be continuing on with my series about church words. Before that, though, if you have your phone, feel free to check in on Facebook, let your friends know that you're here, that you are not scared off by the 4th of July holiday, and you've made it today, because we're going to also be celebrating something very special. At the end of my message today, we're going to be blessing some love letters that we've put together for the people of Orlando, and I'll be talking more about that in just a little bit. So, great stuff happening here at Northern Light today. But today I'm going to be continuing with my series on church words. You see, there are just some words in the life of Christianity and church that are a little hard to get your hands around, a little hard to get your head around. And so I'm taking 4 weeks over the next few weeks. I'm taking a break next week, and then we'll finish up at the end of July to talk through exactly what these important words are. And even though there are some very important words, there are also some very unimportant words that churches use that are confusing and alienating, and I'm going to share some of those unimportant church words with you as we go as well. And so, my useless church word of the week is reardos. Reardos, that's how you pronounce it. Everybody say reardos.
Reardos.
Yeah, that's a weird one, huh? You don't even pronounce it the way it looks. And the definition of reardos is an ornamental screen or covering on the back wall of an altar. And it comes, so yes, we need a word for this, apparently. It comes from the old French words arrière, meaning behind, and dos, meaning back. So it's the behind the back of the church world. They were doing that long before LeBron James. So I actually discovered this word last year when we were constructing the backdrop that we have here with my friends Brandon and Sean and Rick. As we were putting all this together, I was like, there must be a word for that, for the thing in the back of the church. So I have a word for the thing that we are building. And guess what? There is, because in church you've got a word for everything. Guess what? You'll never need that word again for the rest of your life. Just call it the background or something like that, or the backdrop, or, the wall with the cross on it. That's a perfectly acceptable word for this. You don't need the word reardos anymore. So it's useless apart from that. But there's a word that is useful that I want to talk through today, and that word is sacrament. Sacrament is a word that gets thrown around a lot in some church circles and almost none in other church circles. So depending on what your background is, you've either heard this word a lot, maybe too much, or maybe you've heard it almost none at all. And so I want to talk through this word, explain what it means for the church today, for this church in particular, and what we do with that. I want to talk through 3 different questions. What makes something a sacrament? What's the point of a sacrament? And finally, why do I need sacraments? And so, let's first get to the question of what makes something a sacrament. The definition of sacrament is that it is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. An outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. And I won't be able to cover everything today that is within sacraments, especially as I talk through what we name as sacraments within this church. But if you have questions, hit me up, because I love to have those conversations with folks when they have curiosity about how church works and what we mean when we do this or say that, I'd love to talk further with you about that. So, what makes something a sacrament? There's 3 criteria that make something a sacrament in this church and in Methodist churches in general. First, it has to be something that Jesus did. So we can't just say, you know what, we think liking Northern Light Church on Facebook should be a sacrament. Like, as important as that is, Jesus didn't do that. And so, even though I recommend it for all of you, we can't call that a sacrament. Another qualifier is Jesus has to have told us to do it. So, even though Jesus ate fish with his friends on the beach, and I think that's a great idea too, we don't call that a sacrament because Jesus didn't say, and now everybody who was my followers throughout all the time, make sure you eat fish on the beach with your friends. He didn't say that, so we don't call that a sacrament. And the third and final and kind of most important thing is that it has to involve physical objects. So there has to be a thing, otherwise it isn't an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace, it's just an inward and spiritual grace. So there has to be some tangible dynamic that goes with it. So as a Methodist church, using this criteria, we celebrate 2 sacraments, and that's baptism and communion. Baptism fits these criteria because in Matthew 28, the resurrected, risen Jesus, before ascending to be with the Father, says, "Go and make disciples, teaching them and baptizing them." And so that's what we do, is we go and make disciples. Part of our job is to encourage others to follow this Jesus that we find so much meaning in. And then the corollary action that goes with that is baptism as an announcement of what God has done. And then for communion, we just read from 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul explains the teaching of Jesus, that this is something you need to continue to do, is to eat this bread and drink this wine. We use grape juice here. And that as you continue to do that, remembering Jesus' sacrifice, that you're announcing God's life and death and the love of God in this world. So, there's water involved in baptism, there's bread and wine or grape juice involved in communion, and so that's why those are the 2 things that qualify as sacraments for us. Some traditions have more sacraments. The Roman Catholic Church has 7 of them. So they include things like confirmation, and they include things like marriage and ordination in the 7 sacraments. Those don't fit our criterion because they don't always have something tangible going on there. And then there are some traditions that have 0 sacraments. They might practice baptism and they practice communion, but they don't call them sacraments. They just call them ordinances or symbols. Because they don't put as much spiritual weight on them as I'd like to explain to you that we do here today. So, we use this word sacrament specifically because we believe that communion and baptism are more than mere symbols. They are an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. So it's a signifier that God is doing something here, that God is doing something in you, and that God is real and really in love with this world. So, what's the point of a sacrament? Okay, we kind of know how we get a sacrament. What's the point, though? And on the surface, a sacrament seems pretty absurd, almost silly. Like the day of your baptism, you already showered. So you don't need another bath, right? When we celebrate baptisms at the beach in 2 weeks, we're going to be heading down there, and people are going to be wearing their clothes and walking into a lake, and that's weird. People don't just do that. There's something else going on there. And then with communion, when I want a snack, I'll rifle through the fridge, find some Doritos, some Oreos. If there's any leftover pie, I will find it and claim it as my own. I'm never like, what would be great right now is about this much bread. And just a thimble full of juice. That'd be awesome right now. Would have hit the spot. But that's throughout the ages. That's what has brought people together, are these signs of God's grace. And so they're a little absurd, a little silly. But when we're talking about what's the point of all this, it's almost easier to talk about what a sacrament isn't. What isn't the point of a sacrament? Because some folks have been confused and thrown off, being scared off from church by this. A sacrament is not something that this church or any church ought to use to exclude people. And even though it's easy to interpret it that way sometimes, I believe that the churches that require you to be a member before taking communion or something like that, they aren't trying to exclude anyone either. Around here, that's not how we roll. Baptism, we believe that baptism doesn't make you holier or better than the people that haven't been baptized. Baptism here is less about God doing something in you than it is about announcing to the world that God has done something in your life. Baptism is less about God doing something to you than it is about announcing to the world that God has done something in your life. So if you're old enough to claim your faith for yourself, then baptism is an announcement of your own faith. And if you're choosing baptism for your son or daughter, then baptism is an announcement that God is up to something in the life of your family, and that you will do your part to raise him or her to acknowledge God's activity in the world and to choose that faith for themselves one day. And that's why Methodists practice confirmation, so that those who were baptized as small children can publicly announce to the world the faith that they've claimed for themselves. That's the purpose of confirmation, is to transition those baptism vows taken by parents onto the individual who was baptized. And here at Northern Light and in Methodist churches throughout the world, we don't use communion to exclude either. You are welcome to join in communion with us today, whether or not you're a member of this church or any church. We call our communion service an open table, and that's exactly what it is. Open to anybody. And there are lots of great reasons why we practice it that way. One thing that I was talking through communion with someone here in the church the other day, and I said, it just doesn't make sense to put qualifiers on who gets to take communion. So if you think about it, Judas was sitting at the table with Jesus for that first communion celebration, for the Last Supper. If Judas gets communion, I think you all make the cut. But communion can be a powerful way of encountering who God is, God's story, and God's activity in the world. I want to tell you quickly about someone who I heard speak a couple weeks ago named Sarah. She entered a church for the very first time in years. And on that first entrance into church, she received communion for the first time ever. First time ever. And it changed her life completely. She was raised in a secular humanist home. Church was never a thought or a conversation unless it was kind of derisive, get a load of those people sort of thing. Mostly as a reason to look down on people if they attended church or believed in the divine or something like that. So faith was never part of her family life growing up, and definitely not part of her adult life. She was a journalist living in San Francisco, and so part of that role is she would just be present in her neighborhood, walk around and look for stories, interact with people, and see what was going on. And so her meanderings led her into the doors of a church as she explored the daily life of the city. And she found herself wandering into this church, and she says, reflecting back on that first experience, she said, I'm sure there was a sermon. We probably sang some songs. But honestly, as someone who didn't speak the language of Christianity at all, it all missed me. And that's why we're taking time to talk through some of the language of Christianity these few weeks. But when she went forward for communion, and she ate that bread and drank that wine, she had a profound moment of realization. That the God who was only an idea before was just as real as the food and drink in her mouth. It was a realization that God not only existed, but that God existed to fill that longing in the deepest parts of her being. And that thought was terrifying. She took communion and ran out of the church crying. Because she was starting to become overwhelmed with emotions, and she didn't really want to have a conversation with anybody about that, sitting in the pew and having someone come up. Hi there, my name is Bill. How are you today? Can I help you with anything? She's like, I'll be fine, thanks. But she realized for the first time in her life that she wasn't fine. That she in fact needed this God who had come to her at a table in the form of bread and wine. And that moment at the Lord's table was the beginning of an awesome journey that led Sarah to start a food pantry at that church that feeds hundreds of people a day and has spread throughout that entire area. And she's written several books using her gifts as a journalist to explain, or attempt to explain, that mystery that happened that day and how God has called her forward to then continue to share a holy meal. And the donations for all that food and the pickup site for all that food happens right around the altar in that sanctuary. Blessing everyone who comes through for a meal. Calling every one of those meals holy. And that kind of brings us to our final question today. Why do I need sacraments? See, sacraments are the bridge between the invisible spiritual truth and real life change in us and in the world. Sacraments are logically absurd practices, like I said. And so it starts to seem a little more reasonable for our lives to be led by the absurdity of God's grace when we do these slightly off-kilter practices in our life together here at church. So here's an example. A few weeks ago, our whole country was rocked by the news of what happened in a nightclub in Orlando. And most of us were left feeling helpless, not knowing what to do. But not all of us. This church, led by some of our friends, Sabrina, Lori, we wanted to do something to spread God's love in a community that was shaken to its core. And so, they got together and they put together this idea. Let's send out love letters to Orlando, to completely random people, because they're all going to be affected by this. And so Sabrina found 200 random names and addresses. Thank you, Internet. And they handmade envelopes and cards. They're beautiful. They're all up here on the piano right now. And today we are going to bless those with prayer and send them off to who knows where, trusting that God's hand is going to guide them to people who really need to hear this news, that they're worthy of love, that the darkness in their community doesn't define them and doesn't define the world, and that there's a path forward toward goodness and truth and beauty for them. It seems like a small gesture, in a city with millions of people, to send out letters to 200. It seems small, it seems not especially strategic, maybe a little absurd. Just like communion. Just like baptism. And think about this. If our definition of sacrament is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace, it seems to me that these love letters qualify just as well as about anything as a sacrament. That's why we need sacraments. Because what starts with a splash of water or a dunk in the lake or a chunk of bread or a sip of juice can turn into hundreds of love letters. It can turn into a food pantry serving the hungry. Or whatever other absurd thing God might be asking you to do. Maybe God is calling you to celebrate baptism or to renew your baptism with us at our beach day in 2 weeks. To live into the absurd love of God and to announce that in that way. But here's the thing about sacraments. We encounter the sacred through them. We take it into our bodies and pour it over our heads so that we can be sacred. And then everything we do becomes sacred. Everything becomes an outward and visible sign of the inward and spiritual grace that we've encountered. And so for someone who has been changed inside and out by the love of God, watching your kids can be sacrament. Going to work can be sacrament. Writing a thank you card to someone who you think doesn't get appreciated enough can be sacrament. Bringing a pie to your neighbors can be sacrament. Or your pastor. Well, watching your neighbors or your friends' kids so that they can go out on a long overdue date, that can be sacrament. If you need to know some folks who need that, I can point you in their direction. Caring for that college student who's at the end of his rope can be sacrament. You see? Because when you acknowledge the activity of God in your life, then your life can embody the activity of God in the world. And that's worth celebrating with a holy meal, with friends, united by God's Spirit. Pray with me. God, we thank you so much that you are alive in this place, that we celebrate your sacrifice this morning through communion, but even more than that, we celebrate your presence. We celebrate your reality and the reality of your love. And we know that it does more than change us in this moment, but it changes us for good. So stir within us, even as we are stirred by your Spirit today. Lead us to follow you with joy and compassion, so that our very lives are signs, outward and visible signs, of the inward and spiritual grace that we experience. In Jesus' name, amen.